Shalom, shalom, Mishpaka. This is Watchman Yirmiyahu with the Qadashayam of Yasharal. Did you know the truth about Thanksgiving that they don't teach us in school? The other day, my son said, well, at least Thanksgiving is more Kadash than Christmas. And I said, is it though? And he didn't know. There were things that he didn't realize, so I taught him. And then he said, you should tell other people too so they know. So let me share with you. Share this article called The Truth of Thanksgiving. We've been socially programmed. It's by Gaia Staff, November 21st, 2017. There's the table with all the trimmings. Part of growing up in the United States is discovering that some of the fairy tales you've been told about the holidays as a child aren't real, like the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. That disappointment or feeling of betrayal is a fleeting and innocent wake-up call among many more to come in life. But the biggest holiday fairy tale is one that has been used not just to entertain the youthful imagination, but instead for social programming and whitewashing of our history, and that is the truth of Thanksgiving. There is a little video here. I want to play it. Check this out, guys.
From the moment we are born to the day we die, we are under a spell. We are controlled by the magicians who use marketing and propaganda to manipulate our every thought. Religious leaders to company executives, politicians to secret military elites. Everything we do, say, and even think is scrutinized. Mankind has stepped out of a natural state of existence and walked blindfolded in a world of insanity. We are force-fed information, drugs, poisoned food, told we should feel good. We are told that we live in a free world. Everything we do is controlled. Many are happy in their state of delusion. Do you wish to stay plugged into the system, or are you ready to set yourself free? Welcome to your world. Welcome to a false reality.
Okay, a false reality. And also, I want to say that every day is a day that the Most High has made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. Okay? All right. We've all been socially programmed. Slowly but surely, we're becoming more aware of the extent to which we've been socially programmed throughout our lives. This programming comes from many channels and is meant to give us our identities, distinguish ourselves from others, and who we should aspire to be. Though many of us are starting to realize a lot of these social constructs are used to divide and indoctrinate us into consumers, political constituents, and anything that serves to benefit the powers that be, the Thanksgiving holiday cannot be a more fitting example of the historical and continued use of subversive social programming that has been intrinsically injected into our culture. Thanksgiving is supposedly a time of reflection, gratitude, and giving to those in need, a time when we remember the struggles and sacrifices made by the founders of our country and how they were able to break bread with the Native Americans some 400 years ago. So we celebrate the blessings we've been given in life by sitting down to enjoy a meal, spending time with loved ones, and dozing off while watching football. And the next morning, many will rise before the sun to get in line for those Black Friday deals, hoping not to get injured in the apotheosis of consumer greed. But the truth is, the majority of our society has been indoctrinated to fit this mold and is unaware of the historical truth of Thanksgiving and what has what it has evolved into. Our perspectives have been socially programmed over the course of the past 4 centuries to fit the narrative of the appropriate political zeitgeist. And while it has slowly evolved to satisfy the religious, social, and economic goals of the ruling elite, it continues to completely ignore the injustices against Native Americans. Isn't it time to break free from this programming and redefine the holiday for its true meaning. This is a key thing that they didn't want you to know. Whitewashing a violent holiday. By now, there is a greater awareness of the extent by which the U.S. was built through the subjugation of the Native Americans. Columbus Day is slowly being erased from our calendars as a holiday that should no longer recognize a man whose legacy was distorted, making an imperialistic murderer look like a noble pioneer. But while we are at it, shouldn't Thanksgiving be seen through the same lens? Our perception of Thanksgiving, as many things learned in the dominant Western curriculum, is Eurocentric, blatantly disregarding the truth behind the colonization of America. Today, there is no better example of the ironic juxtaposition of our perception versus reality than on Thanksgiving Day in Plymouth, Massachusetts. There, one can find a parade of locals sporting pilgrim attire and marching through the historic town before their annual feast, while a large group of Native Americans are fasting and standing in protest on Coles Hill in a national day of mourning. I would stand with them. Started in 1970, these protests began when a local Wampanoag leader, Wamsuta, was invited by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to speak on the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrim's Landing. He penned a speech detailing the pillaging of graves and enslavement of his people by the early settlers, but was prohibited from delivering it, being asked instead to read a revised version which omitted anything inflammatory. Unsurprisingly, Wamsuta decided not to give his speech and began an annual protest. While some know the truth of Thanksgiving, most of us have been socially programmed with the whitewash narrative that purports of a harmonious feast between the Wampanoag Native Americans and the Pilgrims. In elementary school, we were made to act out this sanitized story in plays, create Indian headdresses, and don big brass belt buckles with pilgrim hats. We were indoctrinated with a misconstrued understanding of history, and who's to say that the teachers even knew that they were spreading misinformation? Some of us might remember being taught the name Squanto, the Pawtuxet Native American who helped the Pilgrims when they were dying from disease and exposure to the elements. What they failed to tell us, however, was he had already been captured by a European sea captain, sold into slavery, then escaped, and made his way back to England, yet still found it within himself to help out our immigrant forefathers in their dire deed. Our teachers would also leave out the part when soon European settlers turned on the Wampanoag and other native tribes. Within a few decades, most natives would die at the hands of settlers if they weren't already dying from smallpox they brought over. And shortly after the first Thanksgiving feast, settlers were literally giving thanks for the death of hundreds of natives after the Pequot massacre of 1637, where 700 natives were brutally slaughtered. Wow. But we must have been much too young at that age to be told of this unfortunate series of events that happened so long ago. We live in a more civilized time today where Native Americans are respected and their history and culture is honored, right? Perpetuating a skewed narrative. George Washington first proclaimed an official day of Thanksgiving in 1789 as a one-off holiday for citizens to pray and give thanks for the assembly of the government, despite all the opposition that it had endured. But there was objection from secular members of Congress who saw it as a religious European tradition they should distance themselves from. But it inevitably passed, and Washington used it to tout his religious belief, while giving his constituents a pat on the back for establishing successful government in the face of English despotism. Unsurprisingly, there was no mention of Native Americans. Nearly a century after Washington's proclamation, Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving an annual holiday to celebrate on the last Thursday of November. At the time, the country was mired in the depths of the Civil War, struggling to maintain morale and a semblance of unity. He subtly mentioned a perceived threat from other nations that might see the country as weak in the midst of its turmoil, feeling the need to remind them at least they hadn't been invaded by a foreign entity. Again, failing to make any mention of Native Americans, Lincoln used the holiday for political and religious capital, social programming, a reassurance into the minds of the war-torn nation, claiming that he still had everything under control. Though it's unclear how Lincoln truly felt about the natives, he was responsible for ordering the largest mass execution in U.S. history, hanging 38 Dakota Sioux. He never persecuted Confederate generals this way. Today, Thanksgiving continues to be celebrated for purposes that largely ignore its true historical context with indigenous people. And while the travesty of a story which happened hundreds of years ago can't be changed, our continued lack of attention to the inherent problems of natives can. The modern treatment of natives. Large corporations and federal governments have continued their interminable encroachment on indigenous lands to this day. From the Sioux Black Hills where Mount Rushmore was carved to the Standing Rock Reservation where the Dakota Access Pipeline was planned to be built, there has been no mercy in the unabashed land grabs we continue to take from these people. A, a concerted, conscious awakening needs to occur to institute this change. Even if one is aware of the horrors our ancestors committed against natives, are we aware of the extent to which the face of the same inequality today? Native Americans are killed at a higher rate in the hands of police than any other racial or ethnic group. And the rate of suicide in Native American communities is 190% higher than the general population. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate for Native Americans in the U.S. is double the national average, sometimes as high as 85% in some communities. These are just a few of the laundry list of facts that outline the struggles faced by Indigenous people today. If we claim to care about these issues, how do we have the gall to celebrate Thanksgiving? There are a multitude of holidays across many religions that are dedicated to atonement and mourning. Shouldn't Thanksgiving be one of those days? Of course, we can get together to be with loved ones and share a meal, but the focus should be on the sacrifices made by Native Americans in the past and present, while also celebrating their culture and history. Using a false narrative to drive capitalism. We would be remiss not to mention how the modern social programming of Thanksgiving has resulted in a holiday designed to perpetuate our current system of consumerism and corporate greed. Black Friday has particularly become tied to Thanksgiving, and those who aren't capitulating to the retail madness are likely continuing to binge on overeating and watching football. In our society, we've been programmed to be good consumers. Capitalism has become our mantra, our religion. When there is a tragic event in Western society, we're told to go shopping. Shopping boosts the economy and it boosts national confidence. And so be a good American and get out there and spend. People camp out, waiting in line to be the first into a store on Black Friday in order to get the best deals of the year. And now some stores start their Black Friday deals even earlier, on Thanksgiving itself. The grip of capitalism is impinging on a holiday whose original intent was already skewed in the first place, with many either skipping the meal entirely or eating dinner while standing in line. Is this an intentional attempt to gloss over the history of the holiday, or merely an inevitable consequence of capitalism? We've already been programmed to view history through a sanitized scope, while also having been programmed to be obedient consumers. Why not just combine the two? What better way to assuage our corporate overlords and placate the masses? But this doesn't have to be the case. We recognize our social programming, think for ourselves, and raise our collective consciousness. This Thanksgiving, let's make an effort to realize what the holiday should really be about. And while you're arguing with relatives over hot political topics like tax reform and illegal immigration, take a moment to remember who the real immigrants were and how we've been socially programmed to think otherwise. So that's just one article that I found. There are actually several. Take a look at another one here. This is Broken Mystic. Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. Look at that name. That's a tough one. Alaluddin Rumi. Um, the truth about Thanksgiving, brainwashing of the American history textbooks. Genocide, poverty, hunger, no thanks. Not giving, no giving. What are we celebrating? Give thanks every day. I say I'm on to that. Give thanks every day. And know the truth, um, you know, about these set apart times. They're not Kadash and they're not of Yahuwah. They're not his feasts. And those are the ones that we seek to partake in. That's for me and my household. We serve Adonai Most High. Those who are indigenous to the land we call the United States of America have been long misrepresented and pushed out of American history textbooks in favor of glorifying those who now rule this nation and represent the dominant culture. What kind of democracy are we when education institutions and teachers refuse to mention the fact that 10 to 30 million natives were killed at the hands of European invasion and colonialism? What is the point of having a free market of ideas when selective and biased history is being taught to our children, right? There is no other way to put it, but erasing the memory of the entire race of people through distorted history is a systematic way of deceiving and lying to our children. Not only are we presented with biased history, but we're also subjected to an ever-growing culture of capitalism in which commercialization of an ambiguous holiday merely pulls us away from facts and meaning. Turkeys are associated with Thanksgiving in the same way Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny have become synonymous with Christmas and Easter, respectively. Through the guise of innocence, capitalism is constantly telling us to consume because consumption equals happiness. Tomorrow is not Black Friday for nothing. And as children dress up as pilgrims and natives to reenact the romanticized version of history, they're not only perpetuating stereotypes, but more importantly, they're being embedded with lies. What do you really know about the Pilgrims and the natives? Consider a high school textbook called The American Tradition, which described the scene quite succinctly. After some exploring, the Pilgrims chose the land around Plymouth Harbor for their settlement. Unfortunately, they had arrived in December and were not prepared for the New England winter. However, they were aided by friendly Indians who gave them food and showed them how to grow corn. When warm weather came, the colonists planted, fished, hunted, and prepared themselves for the next winter. After harvesting the first crop, they and their Indian friends celebrated their first Thanksgiving. This patronizing version of history excludes many embarrassing facts of European history, as stated by James W. Lowen, the author of Lies My Teacher Told Me. Many college students are unaware of the horrific plague that devastated and significantly reduced the population of the native after Columbus arrived in the New World. Most diseases came from animals that were domesticated by Europeans. Cowpox from cows led to smallpox, which later spread through gifts of blankets by infected Europeans. Of the 12 high school textbook Professor Lowen studied and analyzed, only 3 offer some explanation that the plague was a factor of the European colonization. The 9 remaining textbooks mention almost nothing, and 2 of them omit the subject altogether. He writes, each of the other 7 furnishes only a fragment of a paragraph that does not even make it into the index, let alone into students' minds. Why is it important to mention the plague? It reinforced European ethnocentrism, which hardly produced a friendly relationship between the natives and Europeans. To most of the pilgrims and Europeans, the natives were heathen, savage, treacherous, and satanic. Upon seeing thousands of dead natives, the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, called the plague miraculous. In 1634, he wrote to a friend in England, "But for the natives in these parts, God hath so pursued them, as for 300 miles space the greater part of them are swept away by smallpox, which still continues among them, so as God hath thereby cleared our title to this place, those who remain in these parts, being in all not 50, have put themselves under our protection." Maybe. The ugly truth is that many pilgrims were thankful and grateful that the native population was decreasing. Even worse, there was the Pequot massacre in 1637, we referenced it in another article, which started after the colonists found a murdered white man in his boat. 90 armed settlers burned the native village along with their crops and then demanded the natives to turn in the murderers. When the natives refused, a massacre followed. Captain John Mason and his colonist army surrounded a fortified Pequot village and reportedly shouted, "We must burn them! Such a dreadful terror let the Almighty fall upon their spirits that they would flee from us and run into the very flames." Thus did the Lord judge the heathen, filling the place with dead bodies. The surviving Pequot were hunted and slain. The governor of Plymouth, William Bradford, further elaborates, "Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword, some hewed to pieces, others run through with their rapiers, so that they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It was conceived they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire. Horrible was the stink and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayer thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them. Perhaps most disturbingly, it is strongly argued by many historians that the Pequot massacre led to the Thanksgiving festivities. The day after the massacre, the aforementioned governor, Massachusetts Bay Colony, declared, "A day of Thanksgiving. Thank God that they had eliminated over 700 men, women, and children. It was signed into law that this day forth shall be a day of celebrating and thanksgiving for subduing the Pequots." Now one may ask, what about Squanto, the Wampanoag man who learned to speak English and helped the hungry, ill, and poor pilgrims? As cited by Professor Lowen, American high school textbook called Land of Promise reads, Squanto had learned their language. The author explained, from English fishermen who ventured into New England waters each summer. Squanto taught the pilgrims how to plant corn, squash, and pumpkins. Would the small band of settlers have survived without Squanto's help? We cannot say. But by the fall of 1621, colonists and Indians could sit down to several days of feast and thanksgiving to God, later celebrated as the first Thanksgiving. Note that this text states the first Thanksgiving was on 1621. Indeed, there was a feast on that year, but it was not called a Thanksgiving feast, nor was it repeated until years later, after the Pequot massacre of 1637. In regards to Squanto, the correct question to ask is, how did Squanto learn English? History books neglect to mention that the Europeans did not perceive Squanto as an equal, but rather as an instrument of their God, to help the chosen people. It also admitted that, as a boy, Squanto was stolen by a British captain in 1605 and taken to England. He worked for the Plymouth merchant, who eventually helped him arrange passage back to Massachusetts. But less than a year later, he was seized by a British slave raider. Along with 24 fellow natives, Squanto was sold into slavery in Spain. He would manage to escape slavery, journey back to England, and then talk a ship captain into letting him along on his next trip to Cape Cod in 1619. As Squanto walked back into his home village, he was horrified to find that he was the only surviving member of his village. The rest were either killed in battle or died of illness and disease. Excluding Squanto's enslavement is to paint an incredibly distorted version of history that suggests natives like Squanto learned English for no other reason but than to help the colonists. It is to glorify the Europeans and erase the struggles and experiences of native people. When history is transformed into myths, tales, and bedtime stories, we ignore historical research that enables us to learn valuable and meaningful lessons about our present, as well as about our future. History is meant to be an accurate and honest account of civilization, culture, and events, not a body of ethnocentric and selective alterations. Absolutely, we should always seek the truth. As Professor Lowen states, Thanksgiving is full of embarrassing facts. The Pilgrims did not introduce the Native Americans to the tradition. Eastern Indians had observed autumn harvest celebrations for centuries. Our modern celebrations date back only to 1863. Not until the 1890s did the Pilgrims get included in the tradition. No one even called the Pilgrims. No one even called them Pilgrims until 1870s. I do not write this article with the intent to offend or to say that we shouldn't celebrate Thanksgiving. None of us are responsible for the atrocities, deaths of natives and Europeans. None of us caused the plague or the massacre. But as human beings, I do feel that it is important for us to approach history with honesty and sensitivity. Perhaps some of you don't believe this history is relevant to you, but I would strongly argue that a history that is not inclusive is dangerously racist and prejudiced. Yes, we should spend time with our families and loved ones, and yes, we should be grateful and thankful for all that we have, but not at the expense of ignoring an entire race of people, their culture, their history. The fact that history textbooks and schools try to glorify the Pilgrims while omitting significant facts about the natives represents that there is a lot to improve in the United States. Let us not become blinded by super patriotism or blown out sales of Black Friday. Let us give some thought to the native people, learn from their struggles, and embolden ourselves to stand up against racism and genocide in all forms. They deserve your attention. So I have one other article here focusing on the massacre of 1637 Pequot, the real story of the annual U.S. Thanksgiving. Um, This little clipping is interesting. Indian land for sale. Get a home of your own. Easy payments. Perfect title. Possession within 30 days. Fine lands in the West. Irrigated grazing, agriculture, dry farming. Wow. Most of us associate the holiday with happy pilgrims and Indians sitting down to a big feast. And that did happen once. The story began in 1614 when a band of English explorers sailed home to England with a ship full of Patuxet Indians bound for slavery. They left behind smallpox, which virtually wiped out those who had escaped. By the time the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts Bay, they found only one living Patuxet Indian, a man named Squanto, who had survived slavery in England and knew their language. He taught them to grow corn and to fish and negotiate a peace treaty between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Nation. At the end of their first year, the Pilgrims held a great feast honoring Squanto and the Wampanoag. But as word spread in England about the paradise to be found in the New World, religious zealots called Puritans began arriving by the boatload. Finding no fences around the land, they considered it to be public domain. Joined by other British settlers, they seized land, capturing strong young natives for slaves and killing the rest. But the Pequot nation had not agreed to the peace treaty Squanto had negotiated, and they fought back. The Pequot War was one of the bloodiest Indian wars ever fought. In 1637, near present-day Groton, Connecticut, over 700 men, women, and children of the Pequot tribe had gathered for their annual Green Corn Festival, which is our Thanksgiving celebration. In the pre-dawn hours, the sleeping Indians were surrounded by English and Dutch mercenaries who ordered them to come outside. Those who came out were shot and clubbed to death, while the terrified women and children who huddled inside the long house were burned alive. The next day, the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony declared a day of thanksgiving because 700 unarmed men, women, and children had been murdered. Cheered by their victory, the brave colonists and their Indian allies attacked village after village. Women and children, over 14, were sold into slavery while the rest were murdered. Boats loaded with as many as 500 slaves regularly left ports of New England. Bounties were paid for Indian scalps to encourage as many deaths as possible. Following an especially successful raid against the Pequot in what is now Stamford, Connecticut, the churches announced a second day of Thanksgiving to celebrate victory over the heathen savages. During the feasting, the hacked off heads of natives were kicked back through the streets like soccer balls. Even the friendly Wampanoag did not escape the madness. Their chief was beheaded and his head impaled on a pole in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where it remained on display 24 years. Man. Killings became more and more frenzied, with days of Thanksgiving feasts being held after each successful massacre. George Washington finally suggested that only one day of Thanksgiving per year be set aside instead of celebrating each and every massacre. Did you know that Washington was a 33rd degree Freemason? Later, Abraham Lincoln decreed Thanksgiving Day to be the legal national holiday during the Civil War. On the same day, he ordered troops to march against the starving Sioux in Minnesota. This story doesn't have quite the same fuzzy feelings associated with it as the one where the Indians and Pilgrims are all sitting down together at the big feast. But we need to learn our true history so it won't ever be repeated. Next Thanksgiving, when you gather with your loved ones to thank God for all the blessings, think about those people who only wanted to live their lives and raise their families. They also took time out to say thank you to the Creator for all their blessings. Wow, I think that's something. All right, well, I hope that that was edifying to you, that you learned something, that you can take these things into consideration. Um, I say that for us to gather together, to break bread together, to give thanks to the Most High for everything that He provides for us can happen any day, every day of the year. you know, it's literally something that we're instructed to do. Um, but we should also now realize that we need to pay respect and homage to those who were obviously um, taken complete advantage of. Genocide happened, um, and just to whitewash that all over and to turn it into to try and call something clean that's not clean is what that comes down to. So all love to you from Abba Yahuwah, and this is Yermi Yahu out.